Well, here we go with my first model kit build in quite a while, so let's see how rusty I actually am. Now, as usual, I'm going to be a bit loose with my interpretation of the supplied instructions, because like most scale model makers, I have my own process or strategy when tackling a kit build. But because this is a very simple kit, I'm kind of going to follow along with the general instructions, but where I foresee future stumbling blocks, I'll skip adding certain parts until later in the build. This is usually to make the process of painting easier. I begin each stage by checking over the parts and just giving them a once over to see how well they've been moulded and how well they fit together. Sadly, almost immediately I noticed that this Revell kit has a few defects from badly moulded parts which have ruined some of the fine surface detail. But as this is a practice model, I decided to push on, reminding myself that I'd only paid about £1 for this kit as it was on sale. So the first job was to paint the interior of the fuselage before putting the two halves together. There's no interior cockpit detailing, so I just roughly masked the area that might be seen from the outside, then I sprayed the interior with a dark grey. That done, I glued the two halves of the fuselage together and checked the fit to see whether it required any sanding of the seams. And here's where I noticed just how badly malformed the mouldings were on the nose of the 190. The gun port detail on the left upper nose was obliterated and the lower side was just a mess. So I did what I could to smooth these out with the intention of doing some minor repairs using filler or putty later. Moving on to the engine cowl and the propeller, the model has been designed so that you can have the prop spin freely when it's attached. But again, there was some moulding issues where the hole for the prop axle was made off centre and I had to correct this. In the end, I decided to attach the propeller later in a fixed position as I wanted to be able to paint the sparse engine detail and realign the prop centrally. I cleaned up the parts with some filing, getting rid of some flash and test fit the cowling to the front of the fuselage. It was of no surprise whatsoever to find that it wasn't a perfect fit. Revell, I'm so disappointed in you. Even when you consider that this is a beginner's or an entry level kit, I did expect more from Revell. Now to attach the wings to the fuselage, and by now my expectations of a nice snug fit were a bit pessimistic. Luckily for me, the top side fit wasn't bad at all, not great but not bad, but the underside fit was appalling and would need some filling to hide the gaping seams. The tailplane and elevators were quite flimsy, and again fit was an issue, which seems to be the theme of this kit really, and they needed some extra attention to ensure that they fixed in place and that they were level compared with the main wings. I had to keep realigning them horizontally until the glue had cured and they remained in place at the correct angle. There is an option to add a small bomb on the centre line, as the 190 was a fighter bomber, but this was another part that I decided that I would add once the main fuselage was painted, so I just cleaned up this part and put it to one side. And finally I moved on to the last major parts, discounting the transparent cockpit canopy part, which I would deal with later on, and I detached the tiny undercarriage from the main sprue. These were very delicate parts, and there isn't much in the way of secure pilot holes to attach them to, so it's going to be obvious that these parts weren't going to be the strongest arrangement once fitted. Revell provides a transparent stand so you can display the 190 as if it's in flight, presumably on takeoff, with the undercarriage down. This is just as well because I can't see the undercarriage being sturdy enough as it is to support the plane were you to put it on a diorama as if it was on an airfield. Those wheel struts look as if they would simply fold and collapse at the slightest knock. So I made the decision to clean up the parts, removing some of the flash, and then to put them aside until I'd finished the final cleanup and painting of the fuselage, and then attach the undercarriage last. And that's nearly all there is to the construction of this little kit. As I've said, I've left some components to one side for final assembly once the fuselage is painted, but here's all the bits together ready for the next stage of this project. Before getting round to the painting, I just have to go over all the dodgy bits of the kit to rectify some of its flaws and also to neaten up any gaps there are in the seams. I begin with the easy part, the filling of the fuselage seams, which to be honest aren't all that bad. So for this job, I'll simply be using some of Vallejo's plastic putty filler as it's quick to dry. I just smear a small amount over the seam and then smooth it out gently with a fingertip or a damp brush. Curing time for the plastic putty is about an hour, though the longer you wait the better it is to work with. I then give it a light sand with a very fine file or some wet and dry paper, and that should get rid of any seam lines. For the other mould defects however, I'm going to have to resort to more dramatic measures. My modelling putty of choice is milliput, a two-part material that when mixed together has the consistency of a firm modelling clay. It's great for sculpting because as it cures, it slowly hardens and so it becomes easier and easier to work with and create some reasonably fine detail, with some experience that is. Opinions vary about the curing times for milliput, but I like to leave it overnight so that it becomes really hard, and then it can be sanded, filed or carved, as it's like working with a soft stone-like material. The repair work completed and the parts cleaned with a damp cloth to remove any dust particles, I'm now ready to begin the painting process. Now, the method I used to employ for painting models used to be to apply a coat of primer before starting to paint the model's colour scheme, either by brush painting or by using an airbrush. However, due to this being the first model kit I've made since my stroke, and that my airbrush is out of action at the moment, I'll be using an alternative technique just for this practice kit. Because of my health issues, I still lack a bit of confidence that I can do detailed brush painting, so I'm resorting to using some of the small cans of Tamiya's aerosol paints that I have to complete the scheme instead. Having attached the model components to some cocktail sticks for ease of handling, I'm ready to apply my substitute primer coat using Tamiya's AS18 light grey spray. My spray booth being in the attic, which is out of bounds at the moment, I'm reverting to good old-fashioned backyard spray painting. Luckily for me, it's not raining today, but it does add the risk of errant bugs and flies spoiling the paint job. Once the base coat is dried, I now move on to the job of masking out the main camouflage areas of the 190. I'll start with the upper fuselage and lay down the masking tape before spraying the lightest camo colour first, which is defined in the instructions as RLM75 or grey violet. Likewise, I mask around the upper wing areas ready for their coat of the lighter of the two camo scheme colours I'm using. Again, Tamiya's AS4 Luftwaffe grey violet will be used to replicate the suggested RLM75. Now, after a suitable drying period for the first camo colour, I move on to the masking for the application of the second camo colour. This would be the darker RLM74 grey green, and in this case I'm using Tamiya's AS3 Luftwaffe grey green spray paint. I then cut out the negative shapes in masking tape to protect the lighter coat segments of the scheme, leaving the area to receive the darker coat exposed. You can't go wrong because the Revell instructions are pretty clear about the design of the shapes to be used in this camouflage pattern. And finally, after a suitable drying time, I can remove all the masking tape to reveal the finished camouflage pattern. Now, onto the tricky bit, for me at least, the detail painting. Unfortunately, I can't totally avoid picking up a paintbrush again, despite my nervousness. There are several small elements which need some fine paintwork, and as unsure as I am about my ability to handle a paintbrush now, I can't escape the fact that brush painting is a fundamental modelling skill. And so here we go. There's nothing fancy or too complicated about this painting, other than that these are small parts. All I have to do is stay within the lines, so to speak, with this practice model, and I'll be satisfied. Or shocked, one of the two. I won't lie, this took me several retakes to do. I imagine this sort of thing used to be pretty easy work for me a couple of years ago, but now I'm suffering from a case of the tremors, and it took me some time and a fair bit of cursing before I completed the job. With the basic paint scheme done, it's on to the application of the decals. The procedure is pretty simple with the 190, as there's no complex or tricky transfers to deal with, and there's also just a small number of them. I prepared the areas where the decals will be applied by brushing on a small patch of gloss varnish. This is to help the water slide decals adhere without hopefully any silvering or air bubbles appearing. To further aid this, I use a little decal fix solution which helps the transfers conform to the kit surface. I also find it softens and maybe even lightly dissolves transfers a little, making them less prominent on the surface of the kit and a little bit more like they're actually painted on emblems. Once done, I give the model a light coat of gloss varnish to seal the transfers and ready it for the next stage, the weathering and effects. There are those advanced model makers who revel, no pun intended, in super detailing small scale aircraft, using all the advanced techniques that larger scale modelers use on their projects. But for me, at 1/144 scale, the application of weathering and special surface effects is something that should be used with some restraint. In other words, less is more. So I simply add a little shading to represent exhaust staining and some panel and seam lines here and there to provide some definition, and that's it. Nothing fancy like chipping or panel shading. There isn't actually enough detail in this cheap model to really justify going to town anyway. And so to finish off the model, I simply give it a light spray of some matte varnish just to seal everything. The final jobs to do, aside from the fixing of the final few painted accessories, are the addition of the canopy and the attachment of the model to its stand. I mask and spray the canopy's panel lines, as my painting is definitely not up to the steady drawing of the thin line that's required. I then very carefully glue the canopy onto the fuselage cockpit using transparent canopy glue. Canopy done, I just have the few final components to fix in place, including the propeller, bomb and the exceptionally dodgy undercarriage. And so finally, the display stand is glued together, and I also add the little plaque designating the aircraft type. Job done. And in conclusion, as simple as this project undoubtedly was, I suppose I've made this seem far more complicated than it actually needed to be. The whole masking and spraying process could be seen as somewhat unnecessary, as at this scale everything could have been more easily done with just some brushes. But as the purpose of this particular project was to gauge how I might cope after going through stroke rehabilitation and what that means for my ability to manipulate small objects precisely, there was actually method in my madness. Mistakes were undoubtedly made, but they were mainly to do with me being nervous, rusty and a little bit ham-fisted in the way I dealt with this tiny model. Well, you live and learn. The next model will be better as a consequence, hopefully. Cheers.